Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. And in this episode, we're going to talk with Stanford professor and social psychologist Brian Lowery, a UCLA PhD, who is the Walter Kenneth Kilpatrick Professor of Organizational Behavior at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. He also serves as co-director of Stanford's Institute on Race and director of Stanford's Black Leaders Program. And his research has appeared in several scholarly journals and has been covered by the Washington Post, Psychology Today, Gentleman's Quarterly, Quartz, and NPR's All Things Considered. He's also host of the podcast Know What You See and author of Selfless, The Social Creation of You. We're going to be talking with Professor Lowery about a range of topics centering around the self and relationships, individualism and identity, as well as how the social world and such factors as race and gender, community and nation affect and shape us. As ever, we welcome your questions, and I'd like to add also your comments. We invite both, and you can join us and join in. And welcome, Brian Lowery.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you, and congratulations on Selfless, the social creation of you. Let's begin by talking about self, its functions and what it means to you and what you're trying to lay out for us here, at least in terms of the groundwork you've done. Self seems to provide us with both order and chaos, but the underlying argument in your book, which is not prescriptive, as you say on a number of occasions, is we're shaped by our social world. We're shaped by our relationships. We're the product of those relationships.
Yeah, that's right. I think on one level, this is easy to understand. So as you move through your life, people have a sense of engaging differently if they're with their parents, with their kids, or at work, or in any other scenario where you're around a different group of people. So I think people have a sense of that. What I'm, in essence, pointing to is the strength of that effect. And there are times when we can't see the ways that the people around us, our environments, are shaping us. And more than that, those environments don't only shape us, some core that emanates from inside us, but they actually construct that sense of self.
The sense of self has often been thought of as something that can be unified or coherent, and yet I've always believed the self is protean, or there are multiple selves, which is a point you certainly bring to our attention. So unified self, just a myth?
Depends on what you mean. This is, definitions are always tricky. I think of it as masks all the way down. So people will think of wearing a mask in different situations as if there's some version of themselves that's unmasked. And what I say is masks all the way down. And each one of them is real. So is that a unified self? I don't know. I don't like to think in those terms. I think it's misleading. But certainly the idea of one genuine self, I think, is wrong.
I always think about Whitman. Do I contradict myself? Well, then I contradict myself. I'm large. I contain multitudes, which suggests to me multiple selves. And you also mentioned Jekyll and Hyde, which is, by the way, I don't know how many people know this, but Robert Louis Stevenson actually had a dream that resulted in that novel. It's like the benzene ring in organic chemistry came from a dream. The idea, though, that there are multiple selves is almost implicit in that Jekyll-Hyde idea, that we're dual, good and evil.
Yeah, I prefer Whitman. We contain multitudes. The duality is too small. We're bigger than that. So there's something that's lovely about that, but also terrifying.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. But also people seem to operate under the notion that there's a true self or a genuine self. My wife likes to say, you may discover your true self is, we fill in the blank, a profane word. But this idea, again, is kind of a myth, isn't it? There's some kind of genuine self or true self underlying who we are.
Yeah, this idea of authenticity or a genuine self, I think is, again, comforting. And I think it's comforting because it situates us in the world. It lets us think of the world as stable and coherent. And I think that's one function of the self. So it's not surprising to me that people are loath to give up this idea that there's some real them, there's some real I in there somewhere. I get the desire for that and the comfort of that.
But people also like to believe that they're consistent, that they react in social situations in a consistent way. And no, it's sort of like Emerson said, it's inconsistent consistency or consistent inconsistency, something like that. Huh?
Yeah, I mean, but what's funny about this? Would you want it any other way? If you're in a situation that calls for a certain behavior, I'd hope that I'd behave in a way that that situation demanded, and that I didn't just come out with the automatic behavior response that I give in every other situation. I mean, this is again what's surprising about it. There's this tension, this desire to be coherent, and a desire to move in the world in a smooth, reasonable way, and those two things don't really match up very well.
Well, the self can be compared to, and I think you make this comparison, sort of a fun house and all these mirrors that change the way we see ourselves or the way we're seen. And yet, what is it? Is it ego? It's often identified as ego. Is it soul? Is it DNA? I mean, if you try to define self, you run into, you do a brilliant job in many ways, but you really run into many selves trying to deal with the idea of self.
Yeah, indeed. I think of DNA, obviously, let's put aside the actual science of it, but the lay conception of it is a modern day soul. That's how I think people are using it. I think, again, people are searching for some way to justify this belief in some ineffable thing that emanates from inside them that was, breathed into them at their inception, or, was, I don't know, built by the building blocks of reality or something. And I just don't think that's what the self is at all. And I think when we reflect on how we are engaging with the world, that's not what we mean at all.
Well, the modern day soul is also sort of a lost soul in many people's minds. But I was also thinking about how, with respect to the self, I mean, Buddhism, nirvana is an extinction of the self. It tries to move toward, and people talk about being in love in ways that merge with another and they lose themselves. And all these ideas of loss of self are really pretty much a part of our thinking and our culture and what many aspire to.
Yeah, I people point out Buddhism, people who are who studied or understand, some aspects of Buddhism bring that up quite a bit when I talk about the book. And honestly, like, I didn't come to it from Buddhism, but people tell me about it. I think I come to some of the same places, but from a different angle, more through the science than through philosophical or religious study in any case. But this idea of nirvana, right, that people think of, what we translate often in the West into heaven, as you said, is truly the extinction of self.
That's what it is, yeah.
And I think most people are terrified of it and strangely drawn to it. And the reason I think they're drawn to it is because it's the ultimate expression of freedom.
I want to talk about that with you some more, because that idea of that tension between freedom and structure is really at the heart of your book. But let me also ask you about self-regard. I mean, Narcissus looking at his reflection, or Donald Trump maybe looking in the mirror. What is it that makes you think some people almost oblivious to social interaction? All they care about is themselves. There's a whole continuum of that, really.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Honestly, I haven't spent much time thinking about kind of narcissism. I mean, the first thing I would point to is that narcissists need other people maybe more than less narcissistic people do. So there's something interesting about that. So you point to a Donald Trump or narcissist, the namesake. There's a desire for mirrors to reflect something back to them, right? And the mirrors that they generally need are other people, right? So with someone like a Donald Trump, he clearly relishes and needs the attention. It doesn't necessarily have to even be positive, but the attention. And maybe there's a weaker sense of self, a need to constantly be confronted with a version of yourself from people outside in a way that non-narcissists don't need. So that would be an inversion, I think, of how people normally think of narcissists.
That's a very sensible way of looking at it, especially from a psychologist, which is your background point of view. I'm also wondering how conformity fits in all this as you see it.
Yeah, I think when we talk about, I talk about the self, I talk about it being constructed from relationships and interactions, but I also think of it in terms of broad networks of relationships and interactions. And you can think of culture as what we create in these broad networks of these communities of people. And that, I think, shapes how we interact with each other, and it shapes how we understand the self, right? It provides let's call it like a group specific Rosetta Stone to translate the things that you see into social meaning. And it's the social meaning that gives heft or weight to the self.
Do you agree, though, with David Reisman, who wrote that landmark book, The Lonely Crowd, Harvard sociologist, talked about some people being inner-directed and other people being other-directed toward other people? Is that division clear to you as a dualism?
I don't know. I'm sure there's a continuum of that, but I don't think of people as inhabiting two different categories in that way, of inner directed and outer directed. No, I don't think in those terms. I think everyone both has to engage with the external, right? And to some extent, that is internalized. Now, how much people understand or reflect on the internalization, that might vary, but the bidirectional effect of social interactions, that is, in this conversation, I'm affecting you and you're affecting me. Now I can focus on one of those two directions, but both are still happening, right? And that maybe what I focus on varies, but the reality of you're affecting me and constructing who I am in this moment, and I'm doing the same to you, that's consistent across all interactions, and I'd argue all human beings.
Well, what is it you write in your book? Author says, take your little finger and wiggle it. And how many people just don't respond to that or do respond to that? I mean, it's an exemplum of what can be affected by social relationships if you magnify it.
Indeed. And when I do that, one of the things that I think is most interesting about it is, even if you don't, you chose not to, and I affected the choice.
Exactly. It's like I always say when people say I'm apolitical. If you're apolitical, you're taking a stance in being political, whether you like it or it's a negative affirmation, right?
100%. There's no way out. We're all in it.
Yeah. And we've got some questions and comments coming in, speaking about being in it, and I want to go to them and thank people for participating here. The first one's from David in Seattle, who says, is there a benefit for self-image of being an athlete in high school and college? It's a pretty specific question, but your thoughts?
I would translate that to any kind of identity that you have. Is there a benefit? I guess it depends on both the kind of culture you're in and how people perceived you. So if you're in an environment, and I've been in these environments where there's a lot of value attached to being athletic or being an athlete, and you were seen as a exemplary athlete, then I'm sure, there will be benefits in the future. But I've also been in environments where people could care less about athletics, and in which case the effect is probably muted if it exists at all.
Well, there's some environments where self-image is based on, how much you're a gangster or how much you're a bad person and can do destructive things. I mean,
or how many books you read. I personally like that one.
Yeah, I like your backdrop there, which speaks to that. And here's Chris from Tempe, Arizona. Does the image of a closet filled with different costumes accumulated over a lifetime fit with your concept of multiple masks or multiple selves? We choose our outfits, discard some, outgrow some, and decide what to put on each day.
I think yes, except that there's an assumption that there's a you that's not in the costume. And I think if what you really think is that closet is you, that's how I would talk about it, right? There's no you outside of those costumes.
Well, there's also the phrasing of being in the closet, which means you're keeping your real self, what you think of again as a real self, whatever that may mean, under lock and key or closed off.
Yeah, I think, sometimes people think that I'm saying there is no unique self. I think that all selves are unique. It's just that where does that uniqueness come from? And so there's the two things. One, in that metaphor, I like the idea of the closet full of costumes and masks. It's what makes you unique is the particular costumes and masks in your closet. But there's no you outside of that closet, and it's never completely closed.
Thanks for these questions. Thanks to Joseph with the next question, who's with us from Fort Collins, Colorado, who wants to know, do you think our self is more a function of where we're going or a function of where we have stopped?
I don't know that you can stop. I don't think there is a stopping. And one of the things that
suicide maybe.
That's a stopping.
Yeah.
Well, even that we can talk about death if you'd like. I'm really interested in that too. But One of the things I talk about, I think, is most interesting about the self is that it functions as a time machine. It allows a sense of self to exist prior to your physical existence. When you think about your ancestors or people that you think of as your lineage or your community prior to your existence, and that's meaningful to people, right? And you can project yourself into the future beyond your physical self. You can think about the communities that exist or that will outlive you and feel as if you will have some type of symbolic immortality with those communities. So the idea of self, I don't think is what's really, really interesting about it. It's not as time delimited as people think.
But what if you find out, as friends of mine have recently, that they have Neanderthal in their genetic background, or say a white guy in the South discovers that his grandparents, great-grandparents going back, were slave owners and so forth? I mean, how do you suggest that those things ought to be internalized or processed? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Again, as you started out with, I tend to avoid prescription. I like to think about possibilities. If you then feel connected to those histories, then you'll have to find a way to make them fit with your sense of who you are and who you've been and who you're going to become. And how people will do that will vary. But I don't know that it, for me, I don't know that it would matter that much. But that's just me.
Well, like you say, you're not deciding to be prescriptive or presenting your own self as a paradigm here, but sometimes it's hard to avoid, especially, I think about your background coming from, when did you leave Mississippi?
Oh, so I left Mississippi when I was a child. So I was 5, but I spent a lot of time there after we left. So we went back. I spent most summers there and all the holidays. So I felt connected to the place. And also, I grew up in Chicago, but Chicago, at least among the Black community, is heavily populated by people from either Alabama or Mississippi. So when you're in Chicago, at least when I was growing up, there was a sense of deep connection to the South.
Well, you had also the root of one of my iconic figures, Richard Wright, who started in Mississippi and then wound up in Chicago and wrote Native Son, one of the great African-American, or for that matter, American novels. The other thing I think about is one of your colleagues at Stanford, Abraham Verghese, who I just recently did an on-stage interview with, who's now got the #1 bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list with his most recent book. He says geography is destiny.
I agree with that, but I would amend it a bit to say social geography, and those two things overlap. But I do think that, and there's all kinds of social science that suggest this is true too. So you can look at things like zip codes and make predictions about people's life trajectory. The people you're around, your community, I think that is destiny. I think that constructs who you are.
What do we do with those people who are so outside of their community, loners and, I don't know, Ted Kaczynski or something? I mean, they're off the grid and they could care less about presumably social relationships. Misanthropes,
I mean, as we said earlier, there's no way out. Ted Kaczynski cared. He just didn't care in a way that you found to be, or that most of us would find to be reasonable, right? Because if he didn't care, he wouldn't have engaged. And he just engaged in a way that was misanthropic, as you pointed out. I think that if you do not have community, yourself will start to disintegrate. That's what I believe. This is why I think, and people obviously agree, that isolation is considered cruel and unusual as a punishment, right? So I think true social isolation will eventually lead to the disintegration of self.
Can't just sit out in Walden Pond and eat a woodchuck raw, as Thoreau said he wanted to do, that sort of thing.
I think being human requires being around humans.
So where does freedom fit in self?
I make a distinction between the desire for freedom and the thing itself. And I try to spend not too much time on the idea of freedom because, as I'm sure you know, it is a fraught concept. So the idea of, we'll talk about it as free will, is incredibly complex. And the conversations about that have become quite technical. So, and it all revolves around, what do you mean by freedom? Like freedom is one of those words where it's like love, where everyone feels like they know what they're talking about, and it's not clear that anyone knows what they're talking about.
I'll just give you a quick anecdote. I had the pleasure of and the privilege of interviewing the Nobel Prize-winning novelist Isaac Bashevis Singer a number of years ago. And I asked him very solemnly, do you believe in free will? And he said, I have no choice. Which still resonates.
I love that answer.
Yeah,
I love
isn't that great?
answer.
So do I. Let's go to some more questions and comments from Minneapolis. James wants to know, in different social situations, high school reunion, pride parade, or a traffic stop, our self-talk is different. Are these different messages we send ourselves, different selves?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, well, one, you're clearly a different self in those environments. So, and I think the high school reunion is a great example of one in which people can probably feel how they kind of revert back to some version of themselves from high school when they're in those environments. I use that as an example sometimes, but I had never thought about the idea of selves talking to different selves. And I love that idea. I'm going to think about it more, but what I would say is that each self represents a community. Whenever you say I, you really mean we. And so there's different communities in conversation there, is what I would say. That's the amendment. I'll think more about it, but I really love that idea.
But you know, kings used to say we, and they meant the whole kingdom, the royal we, the regal we. Those plurals could be a lot of confusion with they these days, but we can be pretty confusing too. Here's Eric from Washington, D.C. He says, have you settled on a position regarding the topics of consciousness and self-awareness and how or if they apply to artificial intelligence? Is there a good dividing line? Thank you. And thanks for the question, Eric.
Oh, so I used to think a lot about consciousness, in part because it's incredibly fascinating and is described often as the hard problem. Like we don't even know what the right questions to ask are at this still. I tend to lean toward Searle on this. So John Searle has this claim that there's something unique about. I assume he still had this claim about biology that's necessary for consciousness. I don't know that I can give you a strong defense. But I certainly don't know what consciousness is. If I did, I'd be writing a very different book and a very different place in life. I do not think AI is anywhere close. It's not close. Will that change? It's hard to predict the future, but I think in the foreseeable future, no, is my sense.
I hear somebody saying from your lips to God's ears, in terms of it not being close to consciousness, because that does open up many Pandora's boxes. And here's Chris from Tempe again. Thanks, Chris, for the question. How does your appointment in Graduate School of Business complicate or not complicate the ways that you and your work are perceived in the liberal academic community?
Here's my what I say about being in a business school. I study human beings. I'm fascinated by human beings moving through life and making sense of it. Turns out that human beings go to work, and so there's a reason that people who are in business need to understand human beings as well. In terms of your question, though, it's more a pragmatic question. How does it affect how people perceive me? Well, they want me to talk about business, which is not the thing that I'm most interested in talking about sometimes, and therefore have to do a little bit of education about who I am, what my interests are, and a little bit of education about the Graduate School of Business. At Stanford, the Graduate School of Business, I would argue, does engage with business, but it's really a social science school. Like the people there really are interested in often basic questions that affect business, but pretty basic questions.
Can you say something about social science as a discipline? Because there are some who give it short shrift. They say, it's not hard science. It doesn't deserve the kind of veracity that is placed in, or for that matter, the faith that's placed in hard science.
Well, first, I would say I don't know about the faith that is placed in hard science. And second, what I would say
especially after the pandemic, but, a lot of people have faith in particularly the physical sciences.
I mean, it's, science is really a methodology to make sense of the world. And sometimes people lose sight of that. They think it's something else. It's a method to make sense of the world. It's a method like poetry is a method to make sense of the world. from my perspective. I think it's powerful because it's provided insight that's led to very practical things that affect our day-to-day lives. Um, what I would say about the distinction between hard science and social science is that social science is harder. And because it's harder, it's messier. Like human beings, there is little that we know of in the universe that's more complex than human beings and human interactions. And what we can see from social science is such a tiny part of what it is to be human, and our ability to capture that complexity is so limited that it's messy. And what I would say when I wrote this book, people always ask me, what should I do with this? And what I say is, if I told you that the earth was a round blob floating in a vacuum, you'd be like, that's incredible if you believed it was flat. I wouldn't have to tell you what to do with that. If I told you that there was a geological era that we hadn't discovered before, no one would ask me, what do I do with that? When I tell somebody something about themselves that might completely reshape how they think about their social lives, it's strange to me. They ask me what they should do with that. And that's how I think about social science. It is an exploration of one of the most glorious, most interesting, most complex things that you will ever encounter in your life.
Well, your passion comes through, and it's also leads us into a whole other cosmos in each individual, perhaps, or a whole other galaxy. Our fearless leader, Alex, wants to know what you think are the key tenets of building a community.
The number one tenet to build a community is a sense of commonality and flowing from that trust. So, in the book, I always get his, I always confuse his name, but Benedict Arnold wrote this book about the construction of city-states, which you can think of as communities. Well, not city-states, rather like nation-states, nation-states, which you can think of as communities. And he basically makes the argument the printing press was the reason that nation-states started, and how it's a complex argument, but the simplest version of it is when you have a newspaper and you know that thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are reading that same paper at the same time as you, that produces a community. And prior to the printing press, that sense of we are connected in this way could not exist. And that allowed for the construction of a nation state. So underneath that, the most important thing is a sense that we are together. We are a people. The question is where that comes from. That's a different, more complex question. But that sense of commonality, of shared experience, of existing in the same world together, that's what creates community.
Well, nation states also have certainly gotten behind ideology, particularly in recent history. And let's talk about the self in that context, because I've got this idea that America has been built on rugged individualism. You've addressed that in your writing, and maybe we can talk about that. But this has been a culture, at least, based on at least a notion or aspiration of individuality and individualism. And when you look at collectivist societies, the ideologies of Marxist-Leninism, for example, they're built on a completely opposite ideology. The self is subservient to the state. The state is all ascendant. I mean, so the argument goes. How do you see that duality, or that? How does it picture in your mind, and particularly in terms of its effect on the individuals?
Yeah, I think of individualism as a useful fiction or useful delusion. I think the ideology of subsuming an individual self to the state is also a useful fiction. And when I say useful for, certain purposes, so the idea of individualism in the West is useful in terms of allowing us to structure our economy. For example, our economy is built on the concept of free choice, individuals' free choice. But you scratch the surface a little bit, and the delusion of that becomes apparent quite quickly. But it's a useful way to think about how we exchange things and how markets are created and how we build and grow an economy. It's useful because it produces an increase in, produces an increase in quality of life, let's say. And there, the ideology of communism, I think, has been less effective historically. So in both those cases, I still think people are generated by the collective, that people are beholden to the collective, that people in those communities do, in some sense, um, give themselves to the collective. The ideology that's created, those differ and those have consequences, but those are fictions. And I give you an example of what I mean by fiction. It's no different than the fiction of money. Like, it's useful. It's a fiction. It exists as a social construct because it provides value. And I think ideologies, in the case of national ideologies, are similar.
What about the maybe ideology or the at least motivation in, say, a free enterprise or capitalist system to just acquire as much wealth as you possibly can or property as much as you can? I mean, compare that to something like North Korea. It's an extreme example, but, because it's almost a hermit kingdom, but it's a pretty wide disparity, to put it mildly.
It's a wide and wild disparity. I think so. The idea of acquiring more as a signal, I think, of virtue. People don't talk about it that way now, but I think that is underneath what it is, that you feel more virtuous if you have more things. I think that has the benefit of creating the kind of economy that produces a lot of things. Not that there aren't costs associated with that, but I wouldn't have, I don't, some people, hundreds of years ago predicted that would be true. But it didn't have to be the case, right? So that's just the consequence of that particular ideology, right? You could have imagined, let's have an ideology where what is produced is all owned by the community collectively, right? You could imagine that ideology. You might predict that it would produce a healthier community, and it just turns out that, at least the way it's worked in practice, that has not been the case.
Well, maybe some indigenous tribes that operated that way, I think. I don't know if you can
so
speak about it ideologically, but that's how they operated.
Yeah, there's some. There have been communities that have operated more that way, and maybe more effectively. But their exchange was a little bit different in those societies, as I understand them anyway. So there was community held goods, but there was a different sort of the way exchange work was a little bit different. And what I would say is in societies that had less, in societies that don't have a lot of surplus, these things end up working out quite differently, right? So there's a sense in which the common good is innately tied to individual survival, right? And like tightly tied to survival. I don't know that that's where we are right now.
Forgive me, it's also when I think about what are labeled or mislabeled primitive societies, I think about the power of taboo. I mean, we get back to conformity, but there's a lot of taboo that really proscribes or obviates the possibility of the kinds of things that we see afflicting our very free culture, or what is at least thought to be our very free culture.
Yeah. Taboos are really interesting, like the strong cultural prescriptions, proscriptions rather, where you cannot do these things. It's I'd say we certainly have taboos now. Maybe they're just less clear to us than when we look at what we consider or what people described in some senses more primitive societies. But certainly there are taboos now, and cultures both proscribe and prescribe.
So let's get back a little bit to a question that was sort of surfacing before about the role of technology in expanding or constraining the self. I mean, there's all this tension, as you've been suggesting, between structure and freedom. And so how does technology, maybe even AI, but we're just speculating there, but how's technology, as you see it, involved in all this or integral to this?
Yeah, so the world changes when technology changes the way that human beings interact with each other, because there's nothing as central to humanity as interacting with other human beings. It's the interaction among human beings. I think also, let's talk about the era that we may be just now leaving of social media. I think that it's limited the potential evolution of self, in that we are told what music we'll like, what books we should like. We are told what partners we're going to prefer. in ways that don't allow for the kind of serendipity that would, I think, allow for a broader, more expansive evolution of self. So that's kind of this algorithmic structures that people are, I think, um, have assented to through their, I don't know, for whatever reasons, because it's easy to like, it's you listen to Spotify, you go to Amazon, they give you predictions of what you like, and you like them because it's what you liked before, right? It's not because it's something new and delightful, but because it reminds you of what you've already liked.
But
So I
again, there are
think
those
that's
nonconformists who fight against that kind of mechanization, aren't there?
there are, and more power to them, right? Like I like the people who want to flip through vinyl albums and browse bookstores. I don't. Maybe that's just like I love doing those things. I just like other people that do them. So that's the algorithm. The other thing is our digital footprints. I think don't allow for forgetting, and forgetting I think is integral to evolution and development, and forgetting is integral to growth. And I think there's a way in which we have not adequately or in an effective way managed our ability to forget. Because forgetting also has cost, but there's a way in which you want to manage your forgetting that allows for evolution and growth. And I don't think that the current technological landscape has done that very well.
Here's Reed, who says, consider the suffering of citizens of Ukraine. How, when reduced to desperation and base survival needs, does one maintain a sense of a moral center in oneself and the ability to contribute to a community?
It's a good question. I think
Yes.
I talk about in the book meaning in life. And um, one thing I would say is in any circumstance, even those most dire, I think people have a need and desire for meaning in life. I think sometimes people think of that as a concern of the privileged. Right? Only privileged people who have all their other needs met can possibly have a concern about something as ephemeral as meaning. And I think that's just not true.
You read
The
Viktor
human,
Frankl?
yes,
All right,
I,
just for those who
yeah.
aren't familiar with him. I mean, he's talking about the search for meaning in a concentration camp during, the Nazi
hmm
rule. And you can search for meaning under any conditions, really, in
any
life.
condition.
Yeah.
And I think, and so when that question about Ukraine is really what people need is to hold on to a sense of meaning. And in psychology, there's research on this, and there's three components that are necessary for meaning, and the research suggests. So one is coherence. That is, you have to understand your place in the world. It has to seem coherent. You can't have meaning in chaos. And so people need to construct a sense of coherence. And I think the self provides that. So I think you need to have a sense of self to understand where you stand in relation to what's going on around you, to the people you interact with. And you could argue that fighting for the health of their community, their national community, their nation state would suggest there's a sense of coherence. The second thing you need is purpose. When you get up in the morning, you have to have something to do. I don't think there's any doubt that, especially in situations as dire as that many people are in Ukraine, there's a sense of purpose. And then the final component that you need for a sense of meaning in life is significance. That is, what you do has to matter more than just in this moment. It has to reverberate in some way into the future. When you see things like fighting for the nation state, fighting for the idea of Ukraine, what you're fighting for is something that you expect to move beyond you, to live beyond you. And so if people can hold on to those things, I think they will have a sense of meaning in life, and probably um, it will provide a moral core.
Another question for you, Brian. This is from Eric. He wants to know, does the speed and diversity of human interactions afforded by current technology make up for the brevity and bias of those interactions, or does it just make overall quality worse, as in a high rate of garbage?
My immediate response is garbage.
Garbage in, garbage out, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know how. I think every interaction, even fleeting ones, affects you. I think that the problem with these kind of fleeting interactions is that people don't have any sense of responsibility for what their interaction, what it does to other people. So I'm a firm believer that you should try to be as conscientious as possible in all your interactions, especially if you believe what I believe, that all those interactions are affecting the people that you engage with in a meaningful way, maybe small, but meaningful. I worry that what we have with technology now is the ability to have many, many fleeting interactions and have very little sense of responsibility for them.
Well, I was struck by a story this morning, and people will be listening to this, of course, when the story is old and weathered, but the reality is that this is a story that got an immense amount of attention. Miranda Lambert, I think, is the name of a country singer who was giving a concert in Las Vegas, and there were some young people, fans of hers, in the audience taking selfies. And she got distressed by this, and she said, it pisses me off to see people doing this, while I'm trying, you should be listening to my lyrics. And of course, she was assailed as being vain and egocentric. And at the same time, people said it was rude of those kids to take selfies of themselves. I mean, it's a minor kind of story, but it was given great play because it plays into so much of the ambivalence we have about technology, I think, and its relation to self.
I think, yeah, I didn't hear that story, but I've heard versions of that from other artists. I went to a concert where the artist started with, all right, everybody take out your phone, take photos now. And that's it. Now we're done. We're done with photos. And now we're gonna have this experience together. I'm gonna create this art and we're gonna engage with each other.
Larry David, who, made a great name and fortune for himself with Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm, used to be a stand-up comic. And if somebody was talking in the audience, he would stop what he was doing and say, I'm not going on with you talking in the audience while I'm trying to perform. And that would be, his expression of anger, because his self, he felt, was invaded or assaulted or who the hell knows what, but he just didn't want any part of it.
Yeah, I can imagine, I understand that. Like if you're creating art, you're doing it to have an effect on the people in the audience, right? You're doing it to have an exchange with the people who are, consuming that art, and to have someone in the audience making it difficult for you to have that engagement with your audience. That pissed me off too.
Well, early on, when people started bringing devices into the classroom, you're a professor, I'm a professor, you'd see students looking at their device. I mean, they might have been looking at what the reading assignment was, but it used to kind of get my dander up. I thought, are they not paying attention to me? Are they texting? What are they doing? We're in that world now. We're very much in that world now. In fact, in reading your book, when you talk about going into a classroom, it's interesting. You go in, and what people see initially as a black man, they don't know necessarily initially that you're the professor of the class, and then suddenly things change. And I was struck by when you wrote about somebody I think both are acquainted with, and a colleague of yours, Claude Steele, walking as a black man, walking in a white neighborhood and whistling Vivaldi, sort of trying to change the whole nature of the perception and the effect and impact you're having on the other or the others, whomever they may be.
Yeah. Well, now with the gray hair, it's a little bit easier for me. Yeah, I think we're constantly trying to engage with people. Even this is like the whistling Vivaldi. Then Claude tells that story. I don't know if it was him whistling Vivaldi, but the story really just points to our desire to have people see us, I think. And knowing that they're seeing, and I say that, I don't mean a desire to be on stage. I mean a desire to feel as if what they're reflecting back to you fits what you believe you are. Having what you experience as a positive engagement. And I think we're constantly doing that. We don't realize we're doing it all the time.
There's so many people who want to be perceived as more than they are. I'm thinking about like George Santos, as a classic example of that. They don't
I agree. I mean, I think that those examples highlight how this plays out, but I think it's easy to miss the mundane ways in which we're doing it. We're all doing it all the time.
Well, you're right about a study that intrigued me. I wasn't familiar with, about a Chinese women who are perceived as being much more mathematical. And by the way, you're pretty young to be having gray hair. I just want to get that in there, I think. Have you even reached 50 yet?
I'm on my way. I'm not quite
Yeah,
there
well,
yet.
so you're younger. This is gray matter. It doesn't have to do with gray hair necessarily. There's also that study of Asian women in mathematics and the perception. It actually changes when they're perceived as being Asian as opposed to when they're being perceived as being women, right?
Hmm. Yeah. So in that study, it's a study done by Margaret Shee and some of her colleagues. I believe she's still at UCLA now in the business school, by the way. She looked at Asian American women and she had them actually either report their ethnicity or report their gender and then gave them a math test. And it turns out that they perform a bit better when they think of their ethnicity, think of themselves as Asian, than when they think of their gender. And that seems to be a reflection of the stereotypes associated with those different groups. So the way I read that is they were different selves in those different situations. They were as motivated to perform well, but the self that was taking the test was a different self.
Well, there are different selves, as you point out in your book all the time. I couldn't help thinking about Jean-Paul Sartre, who if somebody acts cowardly, and then they be branded as a coward almost ontologically in terms of their being, and then they find they feel so much shame or remorse that in a similar situation, let's say somebody's being assaulted, a stranger, and they act and they do something courageously, then they're courageous. They've changed changed the self. The self is a completely different self.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do that with self. I mean, it's protean.
Yeah, I think the degree of flexibility is amazing, and it's I mean that comes going back to the question of choice and free will. It may be that the situation elicits or dictates what's necessary, and of course, there's some you that you bring to that situation. But it's amazing how sensitive people are to the situations they find themselves in, and so to label someone a thing, right? They're a coward or they're courageous in some some unlimited way, some way that's about the core of their being seems maybe misguided.
It may be misguided to the degree that you want to almost rebel against what's misguiding you. I mean, that's where the self becomes potentially chameleon-like almost, or certainly changeable. I guess that's what I was getting to with Sartre. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly changeable, and I don't know, I'm grateful for that. Like I'm happy. I'm happy
Keeps life
that's
interesting,
true.
doesn't it? Yeah.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah. Maybe the self and happiness. That's so mercurial too. That's so changeable under different circumstances, situations, people. I've always been a little bit suspicious of, even though I think the United States is the only country that guarantees the pursuit of happiness, the idea of happiness as a pursuit when it's so ephemeral and transitory to begin with by its very nature.
No, I think happiness is overrated. I say that all the time, and people think I'm crazy, but I think happiness is overrated. I mean, it's nice to have, but your point is well taken. It's an ephemeral state, right? And by nature, it must be, right? You can't live in a constant state of happiness, although people somehow imagine this as a possibility. I don't think that's possible. And therefore, of course, you want moments of happiness in your life, but that's a different thing than saying you want to be happy as some sort of consistent state of being.
Is that as much a myth as the myth of rugged individualism? That idea of a kind of permanent happiness or a stasis of happiness?
Yeah, I think so. One way to point this out, because I think people sometimes are skeptical, but people quickly acclimate to their situations, right? So they imagine some state in which they would be happy forever, and they end up in that state, and it turns out not so much. They're happy for a moment, and then they acclimate, and they then want more. Human beings want. That is, I think, a stable feature of human nature.
Well, we were talking about Buddhism before. One of the natures of studying Buddhism and pursuing Buddhism is to not want, to get rid of those dukkhas, those desires that you have. And just that's the ultimate extinction that we were talking about of ego, of self.
Right. So here's the thing, that what Buddhism is seeking is the death of an individual's humanity in some ways. That sounds negative, but again, this is why people don't understand nirvana, right?
No, it's right on. Yeah.
The elimination of self. And that I agree, like the eliminate once is a component of eliminating your humanity. And I think most people, one, are not seeking to eliminate their self. And two, even if they are, which I get the suffering that implies, right? That's what Buddhism is trying to, in some sense, that's what it's focused on, is eliminating suffering. And they see this holding on, these desires, as the source of suffering. But to be human is also to suffer.
And Buddhism does teach the importance of awareness of suffering, reaching out to suffering, again, doing things that are selfless, really.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And it's, I feel like after writing this book, I feel like I should spend more time studying Buddhism.
Well, or all religions. That's one of the great things that Huxley taught us. The great religions, as much as they've caused internecine warfare and hatred and enmity and killings of all sorts of torture, are all at least undergirded by this desire to say compassion and love of one's fellow human beings is what it's all about, which is selflessness, really, isn't it?
It is. It is. I mean, it's accepting that yourself is created in the interactions with other people, that it's not something that in a way belongs to you, but is constructed in and exists in the community. And you in that way belong to the community.
Why the you in quotes, by the way, in your subtitle?
Because I think I want to highlight that there's you're an English professor. Language is a slippery, funny thing. An attempt to convey incredibly complex concepts through, I don't know, symbolic words and sounds. It's a funny thing. And some of what I'm trying to explain, I think, is hard to capture in language, because as we had this conversation, we're constantly talking about the you as an agent. And part of what I want to do is say, like, that probably is not what you think it is. And I don't have a good way of communicating that. And so the you in quotes is just meant to recognize that if you accept what I'm saying, that you is probably not what you imagine it to be.
Well, it gets back to the difference in cultures. You know, if you say in Spanish tú or usted, you're giving a whole different social relationship or connection, which we don't have in English. It's just this big you. You know, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Another question from Chris, who wants to know, have you thought about or done research on how your conception of self fits or not the ways that neurodiverse individuals think about and act on their selves?
No, I haven't. And I think about it now and then, but neurodiversity is a very big category, right? So
Huge.
It captures so many different things. So it's hard for me to say how that category of people engage with their sense of self. I think there's some reason to believe that some of the ways in which people diverge from the norm have to do with how they construct the self, or how the self is constructed in distinction from the surrounding world or others. But I haven't spent much time yet looking into that. So I don't want to go too far, but I do think that as you consider how a self is constructed, there are obviously variations, right? And some further from what people think of as further from the norm than others.
And some really have almost no regard for social relationships. I mean, I don't mean that in any critical way. It's just the nature of their neurodiversity. Right?
Yeah, and also often those people have a hard time understanding other people too, right? So it's not just that they have no interest in the relationships. When you don't have interest in relationships, it's hard then to make sense of the social world.
Thank you for the question from Chris, and thank you to Travis for this question. Travis is in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He wants to know what you think of personality tests.
I am this is I won't go too far in this. I'm not really a big fan of personality tests. I think people love to categorize themselves. Again, people want to have a sense of who they are, and they're looking for something that I think is I think they're looking in the wrong place, honestly. Some maybe many personality tests, as far as I can tell, are horoscopes. And then is that to say there's not something stable in people? Not necessarily. Like I've had this conversation quite a bit where say, but there are genes and people have temperaments, and I'm say, sure, I don't deny the existence of the physical self. I don't deny the existence of differences in, you know, hormones or neural pathways. But when we talk about the self, is that really what we're talking about? Or are we talking about the social meaning attached to those things? And once we're talking about the social meaning attached to those things, that exists in relationships.
And how do you account for antisocial behavior, or do you? Where does that fit in? I mean, like what we were saying before about narcissists, that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are ways in which basic human needs go awry. And I think the construction of self happens in relationships. So human beings need interactions. And how they manage that need obviously can vary, and they can vary in ways sometimes that are dysfunctional. So I don't tend to be that interested in what I would think of as dysfunctional ways that these things play out, but I don't deny that they exist. I don't really think that hard about how to catalog the ways in which these things go wrong. I'm more interested in the basic need than how people try to meet those needs and fail, or dysfunctional responses to those needs.
But you do think a lot and give a good deal of attention to the idea of construction of self. You just use that phrasing again. So it gets into how much we actually believe that we can construct a self. Can we be the engineers? And I mean, it's not even free will. It's just constructing a self that we put out there to the world or to ourselves.
Yeah, when I think about this thing about parents, so I know you have children, and like as a parent, I don't, but as a parent, I see people taking on immense responsibility for the person they create. Right? They don't deny that their child has a personality, or there are ways in which there's going to be some stability in how that person engages with the world. But I still think most parents feel a strong sense of responsibility for shaping their children into reasonable, responsible, well-functioning, successful adults. All I'm saying is, like, whenever we interact with someone, we have a bit of that responsibility.
And yet you have parents who are totally irresponsible and neglectful. And
sure, there are people who are terrible parents, which is obviously a shame and a very serious tragedy. But what I'd point to is the idea that human beings believe that they can shape selves, exist in the belief that parenting matters to some extent.
Yeah, one hopes that more human beings will feel that way. It's certainly within our institutions, within our culture, and cultures throughout the world, the value of children and so forth. Do you think that children become less valuable somehow in light of things like climate change or nuclear weapons, or the idea of dystopia with AI? Or there are a lot of people now who say, I don't want to have children. I don't like what's happening with the planet.
Yeah, I completely understand that. And I would say that is a kind of giving up. And there's no judgment. I don't mean that in any way I truly don't as a judgment. It's just a sense of, I don't see meaning because I don't see future. I don't see a future. And I don't, that's not a crazy response or an unreasonable response to the state.
You still see meaning, even if there's no future.
No, I think you don't see meaning without future. Like you, in some sense, you're saying there are no reverberations because there will be no future. I think in that place, in some sense, I think it's a denial of meaning.
Yeah, well said. I think on that rather slightly mordant note, we're going to probably bring things to a close. Let me thank you, Brian, for a very engaging and stimulating discussion and conversation. And thanks to all you who were with us for this week's live interview, and to all who will be hearing this episode on Apple or Spotify podcasts or on our website at graymatter.show. And a reminder that you're invited to join our growing community of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny by going to graymatter.show, and that's Gray with an E. My thanks to the Gray Matter with Michael Krasny great team of Alex, Shannon, Cullen, Chad, and Jeff, and to this episode's special guest, Brian Lowery. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.